Okay, so what I'm going to talk about in this video is a little bit of starting to get into adjustments. Okay, Photoshop is made essentially to make adjustments to photographs, right? That's really where the name came from. Traditionally, in a wet photo studio, right, you have options that are available, like a dodge and burn are available. Um, Photoshop emulates those. So I'm going to start to show you a couple of things, right? I'm going to start with some of the simplest ways to do some adjustments and point out a couple of things along the way as well. So for example here, this photo is obviously a little bit blown out. And what I mean by that is you've lost the value information in your highlights, right? So we can see the lab coat here has almost no information, okay? And the face is a little bit blown out here too. We could do a bunch of different types of adjustments. I will tell you that a lot of the time, shadows highlights takes care of the majority of your problems without having to go in. So the first thing, and be like super anal retentive. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a copy of the background layer, turn that off. I'm going to go ahead and turn this into a smart object, right? And I do that because it makes shadows highlights is available for smart objects, and that means I can come back in and edit it more later. Here's the other thing I want to point out too. If you go to print things, okay, just know that almost certainly what you print will almost always be darker than what you see on the screen. Okay, so that's another good reason to keep things as adjustable as possible, because you may print this and go, okay, actually I went too dark, right? And I can come back in and readjust it. All right, so all of your adjustments are found underneath Image Adjustments. Okay, I'll talk about adjustment layers in the next one, and I'm going to pick Shadows Highlights. Okay. So what Photoshop tries to do, and by the way, this is what you'll see at first. Okay. Photoshop tries to adjust the photo for you. Okay, it does okay. It's darkened up the midtones more than what I want. Okay, and it doesn't do a great job. Okay, with the highlights. So let me explain what these mean. So your shadows, when you pull this to the right, this is the amount of light that Photoshop is going to try and add to any of your values that would be considered shadow. Okay, so darker than a midtone. Okay, or 50%. Highlights does the opposite. Highlights, okay, tries to add value information. Okay, we can pull all the way to the right now. She's got quite the tan. Okay, to the highlight areas. Okay, so you'll notice, right, if I pull this to the right, I can get more value information on her lab coat for sure, but the face looks terrifying. Okay, when you click Show More Options, Photoshop is going to allow you now to come in and play with this a bit more. So as an example, tone right here used to be referred to as tonal width. That means how much, how far of a spread that Photoshop is affecting on a value range. So just as an example, let me pull this all the way to the right. Okay. If I pull the tone all the way to the right, it's affecting way more information than if I pull it all the way to the left. Okay. When it's all the way to the left, it's only going to affect the very darkest. Okay. And you notice as I pull along, it begins to affect more and more. Okay. So let me pull that back. So in the case of our highlights, right, we definitely want to add some shadow information, value information to the lab coat. If we don't want to affect her face, we just have to pull the tonal range to the left. Okay, and when we do that, you'll notice almost immediately, right, it looks better. Okay, because we're not affecting the face as much. You'll notice that we got some information in here now. Okay, now I wanted to point this out, and the reason I'm using this file is to point out one thing, which is Photoshop can't invent information for you. There is no information here because it's completely blown out. So there's nothing we can do about that. The only way you can fix that is if you had the camera raw file, okay, and that makes it more adjustable. As the majority of you, I imagine, are not working with high-end photography equipment, you probably don't have camera raws available to you. If you do, and if anybody wants help with that, I'd be more than happy to. Just let me know. All right, so now with the highlights as well, okay, and the shadows, you have your radius. That affects the transition, okay? So how smooth of a transition it makes. So you notice I pull this over, right? It tries to smooth it out. Same thing here on the highlights. Okay, so play with this until it looks pretty good. The other adjustments here are your color, which is your saturation. So her face is a little saturated, we can see right here. Photoshop tried to add a little more color to it. Okay, so if you look at this area here, let me pull it all the way over. Right, you see how much saturation it adds. Okay, she's now nuclear. So we're going to pull this a bit to the left. Okay. If we really wanted to adjust the color saturation, I would use the color saturation, but this is a good way to kind of, especially as you're playing here, I'm adding information into the highlights. It's darkening things. It also has a tendency to add more color saturation to it, right? So remember, color is made up of three basic elements, which is hue, saturation, and value. Hue being the name of the color, saturation, how much of it there is, right? The difference between gray, like a pinkish gray, and full-on pink, okay? And value, how light or dark it is. Now your midtone here, this is your midtone contrast. Okay, so you can adjust the contrast. If you pull it to the left, you'll notice, okay, it gets less contrasty in your midtones. All right, you pull this to the right, pull it all the way over, now we have total contrast, right? And that means the difference between the light and the dark. Okay, so I usually don't play with this too much. There are better tools to use for that. I will say too, all these tools that I'm showing you, they're fun to break. You can really start to mess with it, right? And start getting some interesting things that happen. Okay, so if you're interested in this sort of thing, okay, you can make stuff look very pop art very quickly using this. Okay, so for this file, I want you to properly adjust, okay, and make it look decent. I'm going to trust your eye to do it. Okay, but I do want to see that there's some more value information in the lab coat, and I want to make sure there's some value information in the face and it's not blown out. Okay, for our next file, let me show. Here is one too that I also want to bring up because let's say, for example, and I worked for a photography place. They said, hey, we need the information on that billboard there, right here, that needs to be brighter. Okay, so shadows, highlights again, let me point out the limitation with this. So image, adjustments, shadows and highlights. Okay, I can brighten this up, but you notice what happens. Right, you see how it gets all grainy and we lose a lot of the contrast. Okay, now I could take my midtone contrast and bump it back up. Okay, which again is not a great solution. Okay. I can drop the highlights a little bit if I wanted to not have it blown out, right? But the only reason why I have this in the shadow highlights, I want you to play with this a little bit and see there's no one perfect tool in Photoshop. Okay, so yes, I can see a little bit more here now if I wanted more information, but the problem is I'm losing some of my contrast. Okay, and it doesn't look as rich because I am dropping the blacks out. Here is what I would do, and here's what I want you to go ahead and try if I were to try and make this a little more readable. I'm going to make a copy of the background, okay, once again, and I'll go ahead, I can make this a smart object again. Okay. What I want to do is come in and I want to select the words as much as possible. So I'm going to zoom in. Now here's the thing with Photoshop, right? When I make selections, I can make an initial selection and then refine that selection. So I am going to just use my my rectangular marquee tool to select this area, and then I'm going to go into select color range. What this does is now I can click inside of this area, okay, and I can try and pick just the wording. Now here's the problem that you're going to run into, right? You see how it's selecting a lot of this? Okay. And I'm only at one color. Okay. So here is what I would do first. I'm going to make a new image adjustment layer. And I'm just going to call it brightness contrast. That's the one I'm going to use. So down at the bottom of your, I'm not going to call it, that's what it is. Down at the bottom of your palette, your layer palette, there's a little kind of yin-yang looking symbol. If you click that, it gives you an adjustment layer. Adjustment layers are great because they affect what's underneath of them. They become built in with a mask, and I can turn them on and off. So for example here, I'm going to bump the brightness way up. Okay, and bump the contrast up as well. Okay, so you see the difference? It'll now make it a little bit easier to come in and to select these words. So now I'm going to go back to, again, and make sure you're on the background copy when you do this. Select color range. Oops. First thing I'm going to do is, go back and make my rectangular marquee. Now select color range. And you notice it selects a lot better inside of here now. Okay. So I'm going to deselect as much of this background as possible. And I'm going to do that by holding down Alt and clicking outside. Right? And you can see right here, it'll show you what you've selected. White is what you have selected. Okay. Now here, you know there's a fuzziness slider, you notice? If you pull that to the right, okay, it's going to select more, and if you pull it to the left, it's going to select less. I generally prefer to leave it at 40 because that's a pretty good place to go from, and use Alt to subtract from my selection, okay, and Shift to add to my selection. That way I know exactly what I'm selecting, and I'm not trusting that Photoshop is doing it for me. Okay, so I'm going to hit OK. All right, I have now selected a decent amount of this language. Now I already have a brightness contrast layer, so all I'm going to do, and pay attention to this, right? Remember, with a layer mask, right, white reveals and black conceals. So what I want to do is conceal the rest of this from the brightness, okay? And I'm going to do that by inverting my selection, which is Command-Shift-I, and then I want to make sure I'm on my layer mask, hit Shift-Delete or Shift-Backspace, or go to Edit Fill, pick my foreground color, which is set to black, and hit OK. Now I'm going to deselect. All right, now on here again, you'll notice, right, make sure there is the layer mask and then there's the adjustment layer. And I'll drop the contrast. Okay. So now I'll turn this on and off so you can see the difference. Right? You see how much more bright I've made this? This is probably, honestly, like if it were up to me, this is a little bit too much. You know, if somebody wasn't telling me, so I would probably bump it down to like that. Okay, so it looks a little more natural. So that's the way that I would emphasize. Okay, if I had to work on the lighting there. So go ahead and play with that. These two, I want you to, again, in that first file, use image shadow highlights. And on this one, I want you to select the language on here, on this billboard, right, or whatever they call it. And I want you to make it a little bit brighter. Remember, down at the bottom, okay, with a brightness contrast image adjustment layer, select the words and make a mask.